Hello. I hope all of you are doing well in your current place of residence, wherever that may be, and that you're healthy, safe, and finding worthwhile things to do in a very unusual and sometimes trying situation. Today we're going to review some of the highlights of the life course perspective. And essentially, the life course perspective is examining how various factors, which are independent but interactive with one another, shape each other and exist at an independent stage as well. So let's talk very briefly about the biological, psychological, and social spheres. The biological, the stages are fairly consistent. Rapid growth in early years, neural connections, cognitive skills growing very rapidly. Adolescence, sexual maturity, muscular development. But even in these things which seem very standard and set, that we're going to go through these stages of development are influenced by our social environment. So our cognitive skills as a young child vary in complexity and type of language that we use, and that variance is shaped to a significant degree by our social environment. Let me give you an example. I'm assuming, with a fair amount of confidence, that everyone who's listening to this is very comfortable with the ideas of left and right, and that you use those to orient yourself. If someone said turn right, you could do that and probably would not give it much thought. There are cultures where they don't even have words for left and right. And instead, everything is oriented by north, south, east, and west. And so that if someone said head northeast, they could do that. If they said, if someone asked them, which hand do you point with? They would talk about their west hand or their southeastern hand, depending on which way they were facing at that particular moment. And it's a very different way of looking at the world. And it becomes somewhat hardwired, just like our ideas of left and right are somewhat hardwired, but it is socially determined. Also, things like the amount and types of food that we consume will affect our body size, our height and our weight, and how quickly we develop sexually. The hormones that are sometimes in milk in the United States do increase, or they speed up the sexual development process, especially for girls. The calories we take in very early on will indicate how tall we are, but also in most societies over time, getting enough calories was for most people a primary issue. In the United States, the sheer number of calories is rarely the issue, only for a very small number of people. But the types of calories and actually our amount of activity vis-a-vis those calories has created a new problem that's widespread obesity. So all these things shape who we are, and those relationships move in different directions. Another way to think of it, or another issue, is the fact that computer use in childhood shapes the thought process. So people who are your age, most of whom used computers from a very early time in their life, the brain structures and brain paths are formed differently than people who are older, who only encountered computers when they became adults, or someone in between like myself who encountered computers a little bit when I was in my early teens. Our brains are different as a result. So here's an example. Conceptually, what is valued socially will shape biological, how biological differences play out, will in turn shape the psychological impact. A more specific example is that in our society, academics and our society widely, not every subgroup, academics and athletics are valued a great deal. And when children enter school or enter arenas where athletics are being promoted, they have different learning styles and they have different levels of athletic talent. So how they respond to those values that society is emphasizing differs. And the results are psychological in nature. Children whose learning style fits well with an academic setting are more likely to have greater confidence and be more likely to be curious and explore new arenas. Children who have athletic talent that fits with the types of activities and sports that are promoted are likely to have greater confidence and more willing to try out new types of sports as well. And so all these things interact. This is simply one example of it. The major themes in the life course perspective take in a lot of ideas. There's the interplay of human lives and historical time. How do those events shape who we are? And sometimes, how does who we are shape those historical events? There's the timing in our lives. When do these events happen? Who are we linked to? And to what degree are we independent with one another? And it's always going to be to some degree. What is our ability to make choices? That's human agency. That's ability to make choices. And how do we go about making those choices? Diversity among people impacts how events and how situations affect them. And where we are in our developmental process, how well we're protected when we need that protection, and what situations we're at risk, will affect how these various themes shape one another as well. So the 5 ideas that I want to focus on in this lecture are the idea of a cohort, transition, trajectory, life events, and turning points. And I'm going to spend the rest of this time just describing what those are. A cohort, as it shows on your screen, is a group of persons who are born during the same time period and who experience particular social changes within a given culture in the same sequence and approximately the same age. So you go through life with these people because you're essentially in the same age category as these people. A generation is a birth cohort, and we have gotten into the habit of referring to generations, and exactly where we draw those lines changes over time and is shaped by what characteristics we see among those people and where those dividing lines seem to be. So here are examples of generations as they're defined in the United States. This is totally a United States perspective on this. The people born between 1910 and 1924 are referred to as the greatest generation. They went through the Depression and they were involved in winning World War II. They were very familiar with the idea of sacrifice and taking risk and struggling. The silent generation are those born between 25 and 45. They were not actively involved in fighting World War II. And while many of them would remember the Depression, they weren't the adult decision makers during that time. The baby boomers are primarily those who were born right after World War II, when economic prosperity boomed in the United States, and many people who had waited to have children because during the Depression they couldn't afford them as well, or during World War II there were the uncertainties and the challenges that made a lot of people decide to wait. And then a large number of people had children all at once, in part because now they could afford to. And that lasted about 18 years. Gen X are those that came immediately afterwards. And the term, from what I understand, Gen X is they had a lack of identity. They were being compared to the baby boomers. They were a smaller group than the baby boomers, so fewer children being born during this time period. This is actually my generation. I'm one of the oldest of the Gen Xers. Gen Y, 80 through 94. Gen Z, 95 through 12, which is, I assume, everyone in this class. And Gen Alpha, these are small children at this point. Our tendency also is to look for characteristics that tend to describe the people in a cohort. They, of course, do not describe everyone well, but there are some general trends that are shaped by what was available at the time, what the opportunities were, what the technology was, and shifting values. So Generation Z, so that's you, have been characterized in the following way. And so you can be thinking about how well this describes you or how well it describes other people in your age cohort. Be noticing also that a lot of this is saying more and less. So it's comparative. It's who you are compared to the generations before you and eventually the generations after you. So you're described as more tolerant, more protected during your childhood and sometimes into adulthood, so your parents hovered more lonely, more cautious of authority. In other words, you're not as quick to trust the pastor in the pulpit, the teacher at the front of the classroom, the leaders in government. You wait to make that decision until they've proven themselves to you to a degree that people of my age and older didn't. You obviously more communication online than generations before you. You've grown up with it. And also less drug use than my generation and the ones immediately preceding you. Less oriented towards church. That might be one fallout from the being more cautious of authority. Less reading, and that's probably related to more communication online. There's also a pattern of waiting longer to establish serious relationships, to get pregnant, to get a driver's license. So you can be thinking about, again, whether these fit you well, whether they fit the people around you well, and what are the implications. Transitions is the next quality I want to talk about. This is the changes in roles and statuses that represent a distinct departure from prior roles and statuses. So something new happens, and then you have the transition is not the new thing happening, it's your reaction to it. So there's the continuation of who you are as a person, but also becoming a different person that you were. And the transition is navigating becoming that different person. So, for example, thinking about children entering school, at some homes, for example, children might be valued and praised for being obedient or playful or cute. And now they're entering a new setting where being organized and understanding abstract ideas quickly and thoroughly is valued in a way that it wasn't before. So now you need to reorient yourself. And for some children, this is not a difficult transition. For others, it's rather traumatic because what worked for their entire life now seems to not be working so well. And it also should be recognized that the environment that they came from, the home environment, the more that it resembled in values what the school tends to value, the easier the transition tends to be for those children. Trajectories are a longer view of long-term patterns of stability and change, balancing those two in someone's life, and usually involve multiple transitions. We can often see them clearer when we're looking at them in retrospect, in the rear view mirror, if you will. And these transitions can be about any part of our lives. I'm going to use an example here just because it's clearer, not because it's necessarily the most important, although it is of importance. If we look at assets, and assets are things to help with the quality of life, provide us security and comfort, but things that in one way or another we own. These are our income, our savings, our ability to access other resources. So skills that we have that are valued by other people, and that's the important part. It has to be a skill that other people see as valuable that you can use to acquire future assets. So what I want to talk about this as far as trajectory goes is that financially speaking, this has been demonstrated in a number of studies. People of lower socioeconomic status, lower class, this is mostly a financial categorization, tend to use all of their assets just to get by on a day-to-day basis. What income they bring in, they have to spend for housing, for food, for medical needs, for taking care of family members, and they don't have any extra to invest in the future. So over time, you see the brown line going across there, their status tends not to change because they can't invest in other assets. Now, people in middle and upper class situations, so people who have a little more resources to begin with, so you see them at the beginning, they're already higher than the people on the brown line. This is the green line. But they're able to invest. So they spend money to get an education or get some sort of job training, or they put money into investments or into savings accounts, or they simply don't bounce checks so much, so they don't have to pay fees and things like that because they have enough assets in there to begin with. They are able to use some assets to gain more assets so that by the end of their life, on average, they're living more comfortably than earlier on in their life. This is an issue of trajectory. The middle and upper class people have a financial trajectory that takes them upward, and lower class people tend to have a financial trajectory that keeps them in exactly the same place. A life event is a significant occurrence involving a relatively abrupt change that may produce serious and long-lasting effects. Death of a spouse would be one of those. Now, keep in mind, the life event is what happens, the very discrete thing that changes. It could be something you expect and is planned. It could be a surprise. It could be good or bad, so this is not just bad things happening. The transition that I mentioned earlier is the resulting experience that a person goes through over time in reflecting back on and adjusting to the life event, and their response. What do they do about it? So using the example of a loss of a spouse, that's a life event. What may result could be depression, or at least grieving. A reorientation about time you spend with friends and who your friends are. A new routine in life, that's certainly going to happen. Later on, for some people, it might be trying to establish new romantic relationships. Other things that are life events could be a child becoming an adult and leaving home, getting married, retiring. And all of these things cause stress, even the good ones. Now, someone could be very happy about the new situation, but there's still adjustments to be made. The life event is an objective event that happens. The transition that I mentioned earlier has objective things, what you do in response, and also subjective, what you experience internally as a result. And how we transition after a life event is shaped to a large extent through how we interpret that life event. Was it a catastrophe where everything went wrong? Is it an opportunity? Is it a test of character? How do we view God's role or fate's role or a deity's role in this? Did God cause this? Is God punishing you? Is God opening up new opportunities? Is God supporting you through trials? This can shape our perspective. Is there a purpose in this? Is it meaningless, or is it done for a reason? Or even if it is meaningless, can we make a purpose out of it? Is my situation hopeless now? All these sorts of questions, and it could be multiple things here, but what we do with it internally shapes what actions we're going to take and the transition we have after a life event. Turning points are a type of life event, but they're a major event that's not just an individual one or for a small number of people. This is something that happens at a cultural level. These are defining moments that people tend to remember. And we talked briefly in class, and several of you brought the example of 9/11, and that had an impact on your lives, even though you weren't there or you don't remember it actually occurring. As a result of 9/11, we are more involved with security measures. We gave up a certain amount of freedom in order to be more secure. That was a societal and governmental decision. There was also, particularly in the short run, a spike in how suspicious and how Middle Eastern people were treated. So they were looked at suspiciously in a way that they hadn't before. And in some cases, there were assaults against people. So those things affected our society. What are we experiencing now? Well, of course, the COVID-19 epidemic. We are in one of those turning points. Now, exactly what's going to happen as a result of it isn't clear. We'll learn that over the next months and years. Will we become more anti-foreigner because this came from outside our country? Will we embrace universal health care because we realize how many people are unprotected and don't have the finances or the resources to take care of themselves financially and medically in a situation like this? Something else that we can't even anticipate right now. All of those are possibilities. So just coming back, the 5 constructs or concepts I'd like you to be focusing on and that our discussion will revolve around are the cohort, a group of people who move through time together, the transition, the reaction to life events, the trajectory, the direction someone's life is headed, personally, financially, socially, multiple ways. Those life events, those big individual things that happen that change what direction our life is headed, and turning points, a special type of life event that impacts everyone in a society, and in this case, in multiple societies, and we'll still learn the results of the unfolding months and years. Thanks very much. I'll see you on Wednesday.